Hello and welcome to Alta Live. My name is Beth Spotswood, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to a discussion today, a peek into the Olympia Oyster. Its past, its present, and its future. This is, even if you're not super into oysters, I'll admit I am not. This is going to be a really fun and fascinating conversation with Dr. Matthew Booker. So as our audience enters, I'm going to take care of a little bit of welcome and light housekeeping. Again, I am just so excited to welcome Dr. Matthew Booker today. He is the Vice President of the National Humanities Center and an environmental and agricultural historian. His recent book, Food Fights: How History Matters to Contemporary Food Debates, demonstrates the historical root of current disputes about food. And his first book, which is very relevant today, was called Down by the Bay: San Francisco's History Between the Tides. He is really fun to talk to about oysters and everything. So we're going to have a great time today, and I'm excited to welcome you all. Before we dive into oyster talk, if you're new to Alta, I'm delighted to introduce you to us. We are an award-winning quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. This is our brand new issue focused on Joan Didion, among other things. We've got Tupac, wild boars, Michael Conley, NFTs. We're a beautiful, beautiful magazine, and I'm offering a deal right now for Alta Live viewers, 25% off, which means you get 4 issues of Alta a year. This amazing California Book Club tote bag. Michael Conley is our guest on April 21st, if you're a LA mystery super fan, and you get a book. So all for $37.50. We will share that with you in the chat. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen here. Please use that to ask any questions about oysters, food history, particularly in California and the West, of Matthew. And also we love to get the chat started by asking everyone where they are tuning in from today. So we'll chat for about 30 minutes, get to as many questions as we can. And this will all be recorded and emailed to you later today, as well as posted on altaonline.com. So without further ado, I'm here in Novato, California. Hello from the Bay Area. Where are you today, Matthew Booker?
I'm in Durham, North Carolina. In Durham,
North Carolina. I see we've got Cupertino, Raleigh is here, Point Reyes, Mariposa, Sacramento, Bellingham, Washington, San Diego. Welcome, everyone. Alaska, thank you so much for joining us today. So we're going to be talking about, Lydia Lee wrote in our last issue a fascinating article about the Olympia oyster, which is the only native oyster of the West Coast. Can you, before we're going to look at some pictures of the Olympia, but can you just tell us, Matthew, if I might call you Matthew?
please.
Thank you. What's so cool about this oyster? This is a teeny tiny little oyster, as opposed to the big Miyagi's that you get at the fancy bars. What's so special about this oyster?
Well, it's a survivor. You know, I love survivors, and I have loved this oyster for a long time, but the day I grew to really appreciate it was the day that we took our kids to a birthday picnic, you know, where they get naked and they play on the beach. There aren't that many beaches in the Bay Area. So we took them to China Camp State Park in Marin, which is this wonderful former ranch, beautiful. So we're playing on the beach, and the kids were cutting their feet. So we looked down, it wasn't broken glass, it was tiny oyster shells. And the Olympia oyster, well, we'll come back to that name. You know, I have a thing for the branding of that name. The California oyster, the Ostrea lurida, was abundant, hyper abundant on this beach. Yeah, there they are. And they're little guys. You know, it's hard to tell. Well, you can see in the scale how tiny they are compared to those jumbos that some people are familiar with. It was abundant there, and it was directly across, of course, from one of the first oil refineries in California at Richmond. So this oyster hung on the actual outfall pipes of the Richmond refinery in nearby waters, like in front of China Camp, and you can find it moored, attached to those barges and pilings near the San Francisco Giants ballpark in San Francisco. It's a total survivor. Today, yeah, I've seen them down there hanging on. The Exploratorium, the wonderful Exploratorium on the wharf in San Francisco, also has a bunch of these growing on their piers. So that's the first reason I think they're so cool, is they have survived all of the insults of the industrial era and the post-industrial era, pollution and changing watersheds, changing taste, and they're still here. And I just admire that. I think that's a remarkable phenomenon.
They're tiny.
Yeah, you have to, I think a bushel of these creatures is something like 2,500 is one estimate I've heard. And when I am picking up oysters that I grow in Chesapeake Bay, actually, Eastern oysters, there are only a couple of hundred oysters in a bushel. So these are a tiny little critter, a shooter, as some people say.
Is a bushel how oysters grow? They grow in what is their little collection or whatever is called a bushel?
That's one of the measures people use to collect them and sell them. So it's a basket, like you've probably seen apples in a bushel basket, this kind of woven basket.
Yeah.
And so a bushel is a lot of oysters. And for Olympias, for Australurida, it's a huge number of oysters. So it makes them more difficult to grow, more expensive to produce, more expensive to buy, more work to open, all of those things that are annoying for all of us in our convenience culture.
What's it taste like?
Oh, it's so good. They're so good. All oysters are good. What's the line from Orwell? All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. These creatures are really delicious. And Lydia Lee, whose wonderful article is the reason for this conversation, interviews Betsy Peabody, who is one of my heroes and one of the original folks thinking about restoration of these oysters in Puget Sound. And she says that the Olympia is distinctive. The Australurida is distinctive because it tastes the same almost anywhere it's grown. Now, I can't verify that. That's very unusual, though, because oysters always take on the flavor of the place that they are grown. They're really a creature of the water, and they have much more miroir than, say, wine has the flavor of soil.
What's miroir?
It's a coined term that is a sort of takeoff on the idea of terroir, that wine or vegetables have the flavor of the soil in which they are grown. So if I'm having a Bordeaux, for example, to poke my dear friend Chad Leddington, who's an historian of Bordeaux wine, for him, the Bordeaux wine is partly a taste of the gravelly soils of the Gironde estuary, whereas a California Pinot Noir has a very different flavor, he thinks. But I'm telling you that oysters have way more flavor. The difference between an oyster grown in the Gironde and grown even downstream in the ocean, in the Atlantic, is very different, much more dramatic taste differences in a very small area than any wine grape can reproduce, because they taste like the water they're in immediately. Look at them. They're alive. This oyster that this person is about to quaff is actually still alive. It's the only live animal we eat. Did that just turn you off on oysters, Beth? I hope not.
I was already off on oysters. I do not enjoy eating oysters. It's just not my palate is very unsophisticated. But I do kind of find them interesting. And I wanted to we're going to dive into the history. Why don't we dive into the history now, actually, while we're on this, and then we'll move into kind of present day. What are we looking at here?
Okay, this is one of these amazing images from the 19th century. It's hard to believe ever existed. This is the Bay of Tideland Commissioners, which was a state agency created in the 1860s in California, specifically to sell the public lands along the edge of San Francisco Bay. And if you look carefully at this, which all of that brown stuff is public land, that's area below high tide, that the state was going to sell for as little as $1 an acre and use the money to fund, among other things, the University of California, actually, right? In 1868, the University of California is partly funded by money from the sale of these tidelands. Thank goodness a later state constitution in 1879 did away with the idea of alienating all public land. But the reason I wanted us to see this image, and I'm glad you put it up, is it also demonstrates a lot of the good places to grow oysters in San Francisco Bay. So, and in fact, there's a lot of fill. The areas we're looking at right now contain, for example, Google and Facebook. If you look off to your right down there, right? They contain the San Francisco airport, the Oakland airport, and a lot of the bay has been in fact filled in. About 30% of the bay has been filled in to make land. And that's one reason why Olympia oysters, Australurida, is no longer as common as it used to be.
I love you. You really don't want to call them Olympia oysters. I'm getting that vibe.
Yeah.
Why?
Okay, so Olympia is the capital of Washington State, a wonderful town. Lived there, loved it. But I got interested in why is it that this oyster, which as you said is common from essentially Southern California, even portions of Baja California, all the way, it's found, if not common anymore, all the way up into Southeast Alaska. Why is it that this oyster is named for one relatively insignificant place in Washington State? Why not call it the California oyster? Because in this map that you're showing right now, notice that it's a relief map, a bathymetric map of the bottom of the bay. It's hard to tell, but see the gray stuff and about, let's see, it's sort of, yeah, I can't point at it, but you can see where I'm talking about, not far from where the Oakland airport is. Some of that is former oyster beds, massive relic fossil oyster beds that actually are still being mined today and used in industrial processes like making chicken feed. But they're also in the footings of the Bay Bridge. They made cement and concrete, which surrounds the bay, the infrastructure, the freeways, the railroads. So this is much a California oyster as it is an Olympia oyster. And it's just a branding capture. You know, why do you brand something though, right? Why is it that the Olympia oyster had to be named that? It was renamed or captured, branded as the Olympia at the very moment when other oysters were coming in to replace that industry. So I think I've kind of gotten ahead of myself here.
Okay.
But San Francisco was the great consumer of oysters in the 19th century. It was a huge percentage of all of the oyster consumption in California and really in the entire West. And it was like a giant mouth that swallowed the oysters and, for that matter, the produce, the food, the energy, everything from all over the American West. It all flowed to San Francisco. Andy Robichaux has a wonderful book called Animal City about the slaughterhouses in South San Francisco that slaughtered the cattle of the American West. So
what's the name of that book? We're going to grab the titles of these references you have in case our audience, can you remind us one more time the name of the book and the author?
Yeah, it's Animal City and it's by Andy Robichaux.
Okay, great. We're going to find everyone a link for that in case you want to dig deeper into this. Okay.
Yeah. So here we are in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and we're looking at a bay which has already been transformed, in which oysters are disappearing. But one of the great things about Lydia Lee's article is that she interviewed the sort of different positions on a really fundamental debate that I also contributed to in my book on San Francisco Bay. And that's where the next slide might actually be really great. This does matter, by the way, to your question about Olympia. We'll get back to it. So this is a highly modified version, intentionally highly modified version of a publication from 1906 by Nels Nelson, who was an archaeologist at Berkeley. And he, like other archaeologists at Berkeley, were funded by Phoebe Apperson Hearst, a really important person. In fact, it's kind of cool that we're in Women's History Month because she and some other names are going to be significant in this story. She funded researchers in Berkeley to dig into the shell mounds around the shoreline of San Francisco Bay. And what this image showed, and as I said, it's highly modified for good reason, this image showed the remaining shell mounds, over 400 remaining shell mounds, that Nelson found when he walked around the bay. He actually walked around the bay in 1902 and 1903. So just to, think about that for a second. These were historical, archaeological, human, cultural remains of an extent sometimes hundreds of feet in diameter, sometimes 60 feet high, like the Emeryville shell mound, which was finally excavated by steam shovels in the 1920s. These are the greatest historical record of Native American presence in California history. I'm just going to say that again. These are the greatest historical record of Native American presence in California history. There are other older sites, of course, because the bay didn't exist until about 6,000, 8,000 years ago as the sea flowed in, as the glaciers melted and the sea flowed in. But these are extraordinary structures. These are not garbage dumps. These are not just garbage dumps. These are also burial pits, ceremonial sites, living quarters. These are extensive and dramatic and remarkable evidence of intense human habitation of the same place over vast numbers of years. Show me other places like that on Earth. I'm going to think of Jerusalem. I'm going to think of some places in China. These are ancient human inhabitation, and they represent this remarkable adaptation as people ate mostly Australurida, for thousands of years. Think about that, how amazing that is. What stories do we tell about Indians in the American West? Too often they're about people disappearing. This is about people remaining and sustaining themselves using this food. So, yeah.
Let's go to the last slide. What is this? You included this.
Yeah, I included that because I wanted to point once again to this question of branding. If native peoples were actively still eating oysters into the colonial period, as Lydia wrote about, and as I have found, and as of course we know is still true today, many Indian peoples who are still in place in the American West, still here, are raising, restoring Olympia oysters. They're crucial for both economic and cultural reasons. But this oyster was renamed. It wasn't named, for example, the Squaxin oyster after the people of one of the peoples of South Puget Sound. It was called the Olympia oyster. And this man, Earl Newell Steele, was a key figure in that renaming effort. He claimed that it had actually been underway when he wrote this book in the 1910s or 20s. He said it had already been underway for many years prior. I should say when he wrote his notes for this book in the 20s. The book was published in the 1950s. But in fact, the Olympia oyster was renamed in this way, in part because it was disappearing. Because it was disappearing and because other oysters, the Asian or Pacific oyster from Japan, what we now call the Miyagi, and more importantly, frankly, the Atlantic oyster, the Erigenica, had come in and had supplanted the Australurida as the great food of San Franciscans and other Westerners.
Now, there's a myth that Lydia covers in this article that the Olympia oyster had declined in population during the gold rush because all of these settlers came in and ate up all of the oysters that the indigenous people in the area had been surviving off of for centuries. You don't believe that's true?
So this is why people hate historians, first of all, because we talk a lot and we're into complexity. Guilty. So in San Francisco Bay, there are these massive relics of hyperabundant Australurida, right? We just talked about that. These shell mounds demonstrate thousands of years of people eating this animal. How can I say that they weren't abundant at the time of European contact? What ecologists have found, though, and really they're digging into the archaeological record, that's the key source we have, is that native peoples had begun shifting away from oysters, from the native oyster, toward other mollusk species, which are happier in the muddy bay. That was the bay of 5,000, 4,000, 2,000, 1,000 years ago. So when European colonists arrived in San Francisco Bay, first the Spanish, who added a lot of dirt with all their cattle, all the cattle grazing and all that sediment that washed into the bay. When they arrived, they didn't find a bay that was full of oysters. They found a bay that was full of oyster shells, full of oyster shells. So I looked really hard, and others who Lydia interviewed, like Ted Groscholtz and Andy Cohen, have looked really hard. And I'm just not finding evidence of Europeans, of gold rushers eating oysters out of San Francisco Bay that they found there. Not large numbers, and they would have. What they were eating were the same oyster imported from Washington territory, from what we now call Willapa Bay, and was called Shoalwater Bay then. And there was massive overharvest. It's a classic European story of colonists just abusing a resource and wiping it, mining it down, fishing down the coast, as one scholar has put it. So they were eating this oyster. They did wipe out this oyster in Willapa Bay and to some extent in Puget Sound. But in San Francisco Bay, the bay was not producing oysters in the way it had. That's what the mounds tell us in the 1850s.
All right, we're getting a lot of questions, so I want to dive into those. Sure. I still have more though. Okay, but they're relevant to what we're talking about. Why is the Vancouver oyster, which is much bigger, so different than the Olympia?
Okay, well, we're probably talking about an oyster purchased in Vancouver, or maybe even found on rocks in the area around Vancouver and Straits of Georgia. And it is likely a Japanese oyster, which is no longer called the Japanese oyster. It's called the Pacific oyster because it was rebranded by Earl Newell Steele.
Is this a Miyagi?
Now it's often called the Miyagi. That's a second rebranding. So Pacific, Puget Sound and Northwest oyster growers knew that Americans in the 1930s didn't want to buy Japanese things. We were deeply racist. So they renamed the Japanese oyster, which was from an area, the seed were coming from an area called Miyagi Prefecture in Japan. They called it the Pacific oyster, and Earl Neal Steele was key in writing that story and in remaking that rebranding exercise. Now it's cool, of course, to eat things from Japan. In fact, sushi was a huge thing since the 1980s, right? And for most Americans, or at least Westerners, or at least cool Westerners. So it's cool once again to be Japanese. So we call them Miyagis, even though they haven't been Japanese in a long, long time. These are oysters that have immigrated to the United States, have been generations born in American waters. So that Vancouver oyster is almost certainly a Japanese oyster, which is either naturalized because they're able to do that, or has been grown by oyster growers.
All right, noted, Andrea. Masha asks, how do we know that the Olympia or Oly, the nickname is the Olys?
Yeah,
I know we're not calling it that. The California Oyster, rebranded again. The constant branding of oysters. Who knew it was such a marketing issue? How do we know this is the only native oyster to the West Coast?
Okay, so this is where our friends, the ecologists, and sometimes our not friends, the taxonomists, have been having at it with one another for decades. I referred to this beautiful animal, Ostrea. I think I called it Ostrea lurida in my book, as having just been rebranded as Ostriola conchophylla. One of the other, taxonomists are forever lumping and splitting and lumping. The latest is that actually the species, it was once thought that this animal was found from Southeast Alaska down into central Mexico and perhaps even as far as the Panama Canal, that it's actually the oyster of the Pacific. But it turns out that if you do genetic work, you can find distinct populations. There's a Mexican oyster, which is now called Ostrea or Ostriola conchophylla. And that, I think it's Ostrea conchophylla. They're forever changing their mind. That means the shell-loving oyster. That's the Mexican oyster. We get the lurid oyster. Lurid meaning pale or wan or ghastly or pale yellow, right? Lurid, but also meaning brightly colored. So it's a peculiar word to apply to this animal, kind of reddish sometimes. Anyway, yeah. So we know that there are two different species, that one is found in Mexico and one is found in the Pacific of North America and Canada.
And that's it. This is our only native oyster.
That's right. This is it. And if you think about that for a minute, think if we only had one native conifer tree. Think if we only had one native species of squirrel or of blue jay, right? Just the diversity of terrestrial animals, for that matter of fishes and other species, is extraordinary. But this animal is so amazingly adept, has adapted so well to the cold currents of the Pacific coast, right? From Southern California up to BC, the water's cold. It's cold in San Diego compared to, say, in Florida, right? If you cross the country, the difference in water temperature between the eastern waters, north and south, is so much greater than it is in the Pacific. That's our native oyster.
That's awesome. All right, I want to talk about again, first of all, is there any risk of this? Is this oyster endangered? Or are we concerned? I realize that we kind of touched upon its decline circa gold rush era. Has it reemerged? Is it thriving now?
No, I don't think you can say it's thriving. And actually, one of the coolest things about Lydia's article is that she interviews people like Ted Groscholtz at Davis, who I agree with. Ted says, all right, maybe we're not restoring huge enough. Maybe oysters weren't hyper abundant in the Bay in 1850. So what? Let's make them more populous, because they do all of these great things for everybody else who lives in that bay. They do great things for the ducks and for the eelgrass and for other species. They are a keystone species that provides habitat for other species and their food, of course, wonderful food. So
other than being food, what are the great things that they do for the ducks?
They trap, well, first of all, most famously, oysters filter the water. So there are other species in the bay now that do that pretty well too, many of them invasive species. But the oyster is really good at cleaning. And that's, in fact, its magic, right? Is it takes dirty water and it converts it into delicious protein, which is usually something that freaks people out when they think about eating oysters raw. Beth is like, oh, you're not coming on board the oyster train, are you, Beth? You should join us. Yeah, they're amazing. They do all of these things that sometimes people call ecosystem services. And that's been a realization of the oyster science community over the last 50 years, really, is one thing after another. First, that they purify water, then that they create habitat for other species. When they cluster together, they change the water's flow. They provide a home for lots of other species. They can remake, in a sense, by their abundance, a bottom from being muddy into one which has more diversity of substrate, like a pebble bottom. They're amazing animals.
Will you grow them yourself? I love it. All right, let's get into the oyster shells. There is much I did not realize, other than the mounds, that the shells are being used for. Two little tidbits you gave me that I find very fascinating are both how they were used in the building of the railroads and how they are fed to chickens in Petaluma, whose eggs I consume.
Yeah, so I think I told you the story of when I was digging around in the papers of Leland Stanford when I was a student at Stanford doing my doctorate. I had plenty of time to look in archives. And I ran into a reference where Stanford, who had many interesting ideas, some of them crazy, was promoting. He hoped to promote the growing of oysters in San Francisco Bay, I beg your pardon. He hoped to promote the growing of Atlantic oysters. And of course, his railroads would actually carry the seed from eastern estuaries, which would then populate San Francisco Bay. But his major argument, he claimed, wasn't that they would be a big dollar value item for the Southern Pacific or the Central Pacific. It was, in fact, that oyster shell was the ideal bedding material for railroad tracks, what they call ballast. So if you've been on a railroad or seen one, they're raised platforms on top of which are wooden planks, and then on top of that are the rails. The whole thing, just like a freeway or a road, depends on the stability of the underlying substrate, this mound. And that mound, when it's made from oyster shell, is just the best thing ever, because the more you smash oysters, the more firmly packed they become. They also drain water, unlike concrete. So they were hyper abundant and used widely for railroads in the East. And he thought, let's do the same thing here in the West. That dream didn't work out for various reasons. For one thing, oyster shells are more valuable in other ways, and one of those is as chicken feed. I mean, chickens' eggs are made out of calcium carbonate. They're made out of chalk, and chickens got to eat chalk. So what's the best, easiest, most edible, delicious, available form of, maybe not delicious, form of chalk? It's oyster shells.
How are the chickens fed the oyster shells?
First, you got to grind it.
Right.
You got to grind it, and then you got to mix it with stuff that they like to eat.
Okay.
But if you put it in there, they will mow right through it, and then it's a key part of their diet.
It's like giving veggies to a toddler. You got to put it in banana bread. Linda asks, would it make sense to install more oyster beds to help clean the bay?
Yeah, I think this has been a big effort by a bunch of people for a long time. Especially, I mentioned Betsy Peabody with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, who's been at it since 1999, I think. I remember when she left the Puget Sound Water Quality Authority to start up that amazing effort. But in San Francisco Bay, also for at least 30 years now, people have been trying to restore oysters. It's not easy to do, and it's harder to do in some ways in San Francisco Bay with this animal than it is elsewhere. Remember I told you the bay is muddy? It doesn't want to grow oysters as much. Yeah, so oysters don't thrive in the bay in part because the things that they like aren't there. And the most important thing is hard stuff. That's why you find them on the outfall pipe, because it's hard. They need their spat, their babies float around until they find something hard to settle on. Preferably that's other oysters. That's their favorite. I won't bore you with it now, but there's some amazing work with hydrophones in which the sound of oyster beds, oysters make no sound, but the creatures that live on them do, apparently can trigger oyster spat to fall and actually land on other oysters. That's how cool the ecology is of oyster beds. So if you don't have oyster beds, how do you get oysters? And that's been a big problem for the restorationists. They have to create structures, all kinds of stuff, from old tires to special structures made with concrete. And these days, the big one seems to be buy oyster shell from Puget Sound, bring it down, put it in the water, put the oysters on that, or things that are welded together with oyster shell on them. Yeah, not easy.
I thought the Oly was a survivor. I thought this was like the magical oyster that can survive in any cold, funky environment. We've made it too muddy. We've ruined the bay. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's such an interesting question and point to raise, because it gets to something else that Native peoples did that we did not recognize until relatively recently because we didn't listen. And I say we, I mean scientists and scholars in general. Native people didn't just harvest oysters out of the watersheds, the estuaries, the edges of the Pacific. They also managed those populations. And there's been a lot of great work recently, including by a remarkable scholar at the University of Oregon, Madonna Moss, on clam gardens, actually listening to Native Americans, mostly women, but communities would build structures, basically small, low dams like kids like to build, trap water, and that would actually increase the habitat for clams, which like the mud that those would create, but also for oysters. The Olympia oyster, the native oyster, Australurida, likes it likes to be underwater all the time. It doesn't like the extremes of high and low tide that the West often provides. So that Native American management is, I think, very suggestive for us today. You can't just wait for this oyster to return. You have to kind of maybe help it like people used to. They actually made an environment that they wanted. I wouldn't call it farming exactly, because that's not a word I've heard Native people use, but it is definitely an intensive management of their landscape to make it better. And we have a problem with that in our society because we like we've got agriculture and we've got wilderness, and we don't really know what to do with the parts in between, which is where we live, like San Francisco Bay. Maybe we need to borrow that approach, that mental conceptual approach from Native people. And I think that's one thing the Puget Sound restoration folks have been doing as well. Listening, borrowing.
Well, on that beautiful sentiment, let's call it an Alta Live. Dr. Matthew Booker, thank you. We're going to have you back because you're also an expert on local eating and how we used to eat locally, got away from that, and are now, I have 8 million questions I would like to ask you. So please come back to Alta Live and we'll do a whole other food-based history of food and local eating if you're open to it. But this has been so much fun to learn about what we will now call the California oyster, at least among this crew. Before everyone leaves, I would like to invite you to next week's episode where my wonderful colleague, AJ Arona, is going to join me to explain to me and hopefully to you, what are NFTs? He wrote a brilliant article about it in our brand new issue. It's going to be released online April 5th. AJ joins me April 6th to explain NFTs. A week after that, we've got Griffin Dunn, Joan Didion's nephew, brilliant actor and director, joining us to talk about his documentary about his late aunt. Michael Conley is the California Book Club's upcoming guest. So with that, we're so grateful to all of you for joining. We'll send you a link to this video as well as a link to Lydia's wonderful article in which she quotes Dr. Booker. Thank you so much, Matthew, for this fabulous and fun interview. I'm very grateful.
Beth, that was so much fun. I appreciate it.
All right, everyone, take care, and we will see you next week.
Bye.